So, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, dear colleagues, warm welcome to the IOER-Forum. We are pretty happy to have Matthew Gandy here today. Matthew Gandy is Professor of Geography at the University of Cambridge, and he's an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His books include Concrete and Clay, Reworking Nature in New York City, MIT Press, The Fabric of Space, Water, Modernity, and the Urban Imagination. It's also an MIT Press book. He did research on moths, and he published this in another book, and quite a new one from 2022, which really fits to the urban ecology aspect, is called Natura urbana, ecological constellations in urban spaces. And again, we are pretty happy, Matthew, to have you here. And we don't want to delay any longer, so please start with your presentation. And if you say I should click, then I can click further.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to present a paper that I recently published in a journal called Progress in Environmental Geography. So if you miss anything, it's in the paper, which is freely available. I wanted just to say something about the context for this particular paper and this presentation. As Wolfgang said, I've been working in the field of urban nature for some time, and this is really my attempt to try to understand the field and try to make sense of this a huge range of literature and different perspectives. So what I'm really presenting today is, if you like, my conceptual map or my conceptual overview, and I hope that we'll have some interesting discussions about how useful this might be for some of the work that different people are doing. So if we go to the next slide, and just to let you know, this is a 1970s style presentation where the slide projector is moved on manually during the talk. So really there are four, in my view, there are four main perspectives, or at least this is a useful conceptual map of the existing literature in relation to urban nature and urban ecology. I would suggest that a first strand, which we could refer to as systems-based approaches, is very much the dominant approach across most university programs, professional practice, and in most of the literature that we come across. A second strand that I'm going to talk about is that of observational paradigms. And interestingly, this actually we can trace back to the 19th century and a growing fascination for unusual assemblages of nature within urban and industrial spaces. A third strand, which my own work has been quite closely associated with, is that of urban political ecology, emerging from the mid-1990s onwards and taking very much a neo-Marxian perspective on environmental contestations within the urban arena. And then the fourth strand of pluriversal ecologies, this is more recent and connects with ideas surrounding multi-species urbanism, multi-species ethnographies, new dialogues between human geography and cultural anthropology, for example, a closer attention to the diversity of ontologies of nature within urban space. So these are the four strands that I'm going to outline with you today. So if we start then with the first strand, which is systems-based approaches. Now, as I've suggested, this is very much the dominant approach, and for some of the literature within the systems-based approach, there's a direct connection sketched with the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, So there's, if you like, there's a historiography to this approach itself. And in particular, for example, with the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, using a variety of botanical or scientific metaphors to understand the succession dynamics within urban space, borrowing from a plant succession literature, and also connecting with what you could describe as an atomistic or competition-based or choice-based model of human behavior within urban space. Now, this systems-based approach, if we move on to the next slide, the systems-based approach really begins to gather momentum in the 1970s, particularly through the work of the tropical biologist Paul Duvigneau, the emergence of the so-called Brussels School of Urban Sociology, where Duvigneau really tried to measure everything in urban space, both material transfers and energy transfers, and build a very complex, quantitative, flow-based model of the urban ecology of a modern metropolis. Now, this attempt to measure urban space and present urban space as a space of flows is also found in other approaches, such as Abel Wohlmann's influential essay, The Metabolism of Cities from 1965. So this emphasis then on various forms of diagrammatic representation of urban space. And there are many other fascinating diagrams that Duvigneau and his colleagues prepared. Now, this systems-based approach also gathers momentum in North America, particularly in relation to the initiation of long-term funding for urban environmental processes with research teams based in Phoenix and also Baltimore. So we have the Baltimore School of Urban Ecology, which also builds on this notion of modeling and flow-based analysis. It's very much based within what we might term the neo-positivist biophysical sciences in terms of its conception of knowledge building. And the Baltimore School, intriguingly, also suggests that they are the natural successor to the earlier Chicago School. So we see this kind of lineage of urban ecological thinking. More recently, we could say that the Vienna School, also Marina Fischer-Kowalski and her colleagues, also develops in a different way, but very much building on this notion of socio-ecological systems, another very influential branch of thinking connected here. And then, of course, there are a variety of influential textbooks used in universities, which build very much on this systems-based paradigm. Now, I just want to mention a couple of points of criticism in relation to many of these approaches. One particular issue is a kind of an assumed epistemological unity between the biophysical and social sciences. The idea that ecological systems and social systems can be unproblematically combined together within a unified epistemological framework. A second point of criticism would be there's a naturalization of the global economy and capitalist urbanization in particular. That very few of these models and very few of these approaches explicitly talk about transcending capitalist urbanization. And perhaps a further point of potential criticism is that these approaches align quite closely with aspects of the adaptive Anthropocene discourse and resilience discourse. So in that sense, they fully align with the contemporary drift of policymaking. So we see some other examples, the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, also elaborating on many of these approaches with perhaps a greater emphasis on landscape design, but nevertheless using similar underlying philosophical arguments. And then the popular literature on the Anthropocene, Earl Ellis is an example, connected with the eco-modernist thesis, and the notion that essentially, if we can make agriculture more efficient, there's no particular problem in enabling further urbanization and industrialization. So it's very much a technocentric model in relation to environmental transitions. So moving on to observational paradigms. As I mentioned, these certainly have their roots in 19th century approaches. And just to give you some interesting examples, there's the botanist Richard Deacon's study of the Colosseum in Rome in the 1850s, where he found over 400 different species of plants growing on the Colosseum, including a variety of species which originated from North Africa, perhaps connected with trade routes under the Roman Empire and so on. So this was very much an intricate global flora to be found within the ruins of the Colosseum. So this fascination then with ruins, old buildings, marginal sites begins to gather momentum through the 19th century. In the late 19th century, there are a variety of interesting studies of plants growing around industrial cities in Germany, Belgium, and elsewhere. And during wartime, the creation of rubble landscapes, so-called bomb sites or Trümmerlandschaften, also generated intense botanical interest, because these were ecological tabula rasa within which all kinds of unusual spontaneous assemblages of plants could be found. And in relation to European cities, we can see the roots here of the Berlin school of urban ecology, led by figures such as Herbert Zukop and Ingo Kovarik. And the early studies, particularly led by Zukop and his colleagues, really centered on these unusual plants to be found in these war-damaged, stony, rubble-dominated landscapes. And there were certain signature plants within this literature. Dysphania botrytis was a fragrant Mediterranean herb that was flourishing in these hot and stony urban environments. And it became a kind of signature plant within a lot of this literature. Also, during this time, what's quite interesting about the Berlin School of Urban Ecology is that with the geopolitical division of the city, the scientists within the island city became increasingly, you could say almost obsessively focused on plants growing within the island city. So they produced these very intricate maps, like you can see here, where almost every street or locality has been given a special designation in relation to its assemblage of plants. So an immensely time-consuming and complex process of mapping the urban ecology of the city, and then of course the terra incognita of the former DDR beyond. So a lot of very interesting maps produced. Now, Berlin has been very important for me in terms of my own work and my own thinking on urban ecology. And there is a particular site in the Chausseestrasse that I studied quite intensively over a number of years. This has now disappeared. There's a luxury hotel called The Garden on this very site. But in terms of the studies that I was doing, I was extremely interested in learning about botany, learning about plants that are distinctive in relation to these sites. The Echium vulgari, you can certainly, Nattenkopf, I think is the German name. I'm sure you can find around Dresden as well. But the Wolfgang mentioned my interest in insects. There's a very rare insect, Cuculia fraudatrix, a kind of moth I found on this site, which is an example of a species from steppe landscapes in Ukraine or Russia that has gradually extended westwards into these Brachen or post-industrial sites with a similar kind of ecological assemblage of grasses and things of that kind. So part of what really fascinated me about this site is the intricate story to be found through the unique assemblage of species in this site, that bringing together local, regional, and global histories. Now, in the literature, there's much discussion about novel ecosystems or new ecosystems, and other interesting examples in terms of the avian fauna of London and many other European cities is the rose-ringed parakeet. So these birds are now a familiar sound as well as sight within many urban spaces across Europe. And of course, in relation to novel ecosystems, um, uh, new species have sometimes provoked intense debate over whether these species are invasive or whether they pose no threat at all to existing flora and fauna. So there are political connotations in terms of debates about these novel ecosystems. Now, one of the interesting connections with observational paradigms is the connection with citizen science. And the growing public interest in urban nature. So one of the projects I've been involved in the Berlin-Brandenburg region is recording of insects for a cartographic project. And the Park am Gleisdreieck, for example, which in itself is a fascinating site in terms of bringing together design elements from Brachen or Stadtwildnis and combining that with a very sophisticated new landscape design. The Park am Gleisdreieck supports various rare insects. So in terms of the citizen science project, I'm pleased to be able to send my own records in, and then you have your own little blob on this map. So you're kind of part of a kind of a larger scientific project. But in addition to the citizen science aspects, I should also mention the arts-science interface, that many very fascinating insights into unusual aspects of urban ecology have actually been led by artists rather than scientists. So the Brazilian artist Maria Teresa Alves, her Seeds of Change project looks at soils in port cities, soils associated with so-called ballast sites where ships got rid of earth, rocks and stones and so on as they move from port to port. And within these soils, she's cultivated from these seeds a kind of global flora which reveals interesting aspects of global history and transatlantic slave routes as well. So aspects of European colonialism are also revealed through these global flora compositions that Alves has put together. So moving on to the third strand of urban political ecology, this really picked up momentum from the mid-1990s onwards. The work of the geographer Eric Swingerdow really features prominently here, and in particular his pioneering work on Guayaquil in Ecuador and piecing together transformations in urban infrastructure with commodity price changes, political regimes and other factors, but fundamentally an aspect of urban history through an ecological lens. Now, there was an influential collection of essays published in 2006 in The Nature of Cities, and for many people, this is a kind of marker of the so-called first wave of urban political ecology. And one important inspiration I would suggest for the first wave of urban political ecology was the environmental justice movement, particularly as it took shape in North America. And when I was doing work on New York City quite a long time ago now, actually in the late 1990s, I was interested in contemporary environmental issues, and I was told to look at the late 60s and early 70s and some of the pioneering urban environmental movements campaigning against things such as inadequate housing, lead poisoning, the prevalence of tuberculosis, inadequate garbage collection. So the human environment, the urban environment, really took center stage. So with urban political ecology, the focus shifting very much to the human environment and the political dimensions. Now, in recent years, urban political ecology has gone through certain shifts and changes. And one thing I would like to really pose in today's presentation is thinking about some of the future directions that urban political ecology could take. So just to mention a few of the aspects to consider. One criticism of urban political ecology has been its lack of direct engagement with the science of ecology itself. In other words, ecology has more of a metaphorical presence rather than an analytical presence within this literature. So some of the more recent work has really addressed this in important ways. So the sociologist Jens Lachmann, looking at the way ecologists in Berlin became political activists in relation to land use planning, and specific sites such as the Südgelände nature reserve really came out of this very important historical moment in terms of raising the stakes in terms of the politics of land use planning, and critically, very occasionally successfully arguing that these unusual interstitial landscapes should be protected from development. So the politics of ecology itself, if you like. Another weakness perhaps within the urban political ecology literature related to the human subject and thinking about multi-sensory dimensions to urban space. So I use this example here of the percussionist and sound artist Merin Royards, who tries to diagrammatically represent the echoes under a railway arch in West London. But the point I'm really suggesting here is that urban political ecology could certainly have a more imaginative engagement with multisensory geographies, and also deploy a wider range of methods as well in relation to urban environments. Another point of discussion within the urban political ecology literature relates to what you could describe as the neo-Lefebvrean challenge in urban theory and the emphasis on planetary urbanization. Now, some of the literature is clearly in tension between what you could refer to as a kind of methodological globalism, which lacks a kind of a local differentiation of geographical and historical specificities. And one of the tensions around generic and specific ecologies in relation to landscape design, one example I think is quite interesting, is the city forest garden in Chengdu in southern China, which was modeled after an award-winning Italian development, the Bosco Verticali. But there was one small problem, that in terms of the local ecology of Chengdu, this vertical forest was the perfect breeding ground for our insect vectors for disease, and in particular mosquitoes that carry dengue. So for ecological reasons, this was proved extremely complicated to successfully sell these apartments. But it nevertheless illustrates the difficulty of a kind of generic ecological sensibility that really grafts models and approaches around different parts of the world. Another, in a way, a natural area for urban political ecology to develop further is in relation to public health and urban epidemiology. And if you look at the rise of dengue and also other risks such as the Zika outbreak in the Americas in 2016, analysis shows that the risk is closely connected with specific kinds of urban topographies, dysfunctional infrastructure systems, large amounts of standing water, sometimes out of necessity because people need to store water because of intermittent supply and so on, and that these provide perfect breeding grounds for the Aedes genus of mosquitoes and other insect vectors. So it's really bringing the politics and topography of urban space together with urban epidemiology. And in some of my current work, I've been exploring what I call zoonotic urbanization, and thinking about heightened levels of epidemiological risk in cities, and this relationship to more distant extractive frontiers, or so-called zoonotic transfer zones. And then another area which I think could really enrich urban political ecology is a closer engagement with the environmental humanities. And I would say that Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence, is really absolutely critical in terms of fostering a new kind of dialogue between literature and environmental politics. And the critical thing about Rob Nixon's book is that the entry point for his extremely interesting discussion is what has been written about specific environments, sometimes fiction, sometimes investigative journalism, but it's the creativity and insights of writing itself that forms the entry point into discussions about environmental change. And then the Indian author, Amitav Ghosh, who's written a number of interesting novels with an environmental theme, but he's also written more of a theoretical intervention here, The Great Derangement. And Ghosh's main point is that contemporary literature, and perhaps by extension other forms of cultural production, such as cinema, perhaps, or other areas, has not yet fully engaged with the scale of global environmental threats. And in particular, he describes how the classic novel, the modern novel, very much grew up in relation to certain narrative structures, such as the rural to urban transition, industrialization, and other processes. And he really asks what kind of novel, or what structure of novel, could meet the challenge of contemporary environmental change. And then a final strand, which I've been thinking about, is whether some of the remarkable insights from the forensic architecture school initiated at Goldsmiths College in London could somehow be extended into a notion of forensic ecologies. Now, within studies of crime and crime sites, forensic entomology has been very important over many centuries. And one of the intriguing analogies for me is the possibility of using very precise environmental data, for example, mass invertebrate decline or different distributions of insects, to give insights into patterns of global disruption. In other words, moving from the classic individual crime scene of forensic entomology to the larger sense of a global environmental crime in terms of the scale of environmental change. So I think this is something that could be very interesting to consider. And then I think I should mention something about contemporary debates, particularly in relation to metabolic rift and degrowth. I know that there's been some interesting discussion here, and some of you just had a paper out in Urban Studies just recently on this very topic. So there are interesting debates now about what degrowth actually means in terms of political change. And we can see some interesting tensions within the literature. Kohei Sato is perhaps one of the most influential figures, calling for a fundamental overhaul of neo-Marxian theory. And I would suggest this has implications for urban political ecology because of its close connections with neo-Marxian thought. And Eric Swingerdow and others, Henrik Ernstsen too, have also been exploring some of the if you like, the outer contours of neo-Marxian environmental theory. So my last strand that I wanted to talk about is that of pluriversal ecologies, and to think about some of the more recent debates and discussions that have been going on in relation to urban nature. But perhaps first, a useful starting point is that of the geographer Jennifer Walsh, who published this path-breaking essay, Zoopolis, back in 1996. And she makes a number of very interesting arguments, but the idea that welcoming the presence of animals within urban space, wild animals, and she's thinking, of course, about Los Angeles and coyotes and so on, but thinking about the presence of wild animals in urban space has multiple implications in terms of how we live in cities. And she also, by implication, a different kind of environmental ethics in relation to urban space. Now, thinking about the return of nature to cities, and this has been a prominent theme here. In Indian cities, for example, leopards are quite frequent on the urban fringe, and leopards prey on stray dogs, for example, and stray dogs are carriers of rabies. So we see some rather complicated leopard canine epidemiological connections here on the fringe of Indian cities. The notion of living differently with wild nature in cities is presented in Nicolette Krabitz's fantastic film Wild, which is actually set in Halle, not so far from here, about a young woman who forms a kind of relationship with a wolf that visits the inner part of the city. But it's really a wider meditation on the way that a relationship between a wolf and a human renders both of them more similar in subtle ways. So there's a kind of feral ecologies and a de-domestication element to the narrative structure here. When I was doing some work in Paris, I was very intrigued to see these posters on the metro. And there's quite a strong movement now in relation to the rats of Paris and certain other cities as well, to say, you know, why can't we just really leave them alone? You know, why do we have to persecute them? Maybe there are kinder ways of controlling the populations of unwanted animals in cities. And there are, in fact, discussions about the use of contraceptives, for example, for rats and other rodents, rather than poison. And there are very interesting discussions about the ethics of cohabitation. However, I mean, rats has become quite a hot political topic in Paris for a variety of reasons. So opinions, we can say, are strongly divided. But the fundamental notion is that, you know, rats have personalities too. You know, they form friendships, they think about things, they have a right to be here. So why are we obsessed with trying to eradicate them? And I mentioned in passing earlier Park am Gleisdreieck in Berlin. This is one of a number of new landscape design projects, an award-winning park actually, which very interestingly seeks to combine some elements of these interstitial ecologies or spontaneous ecologies I mentioned earlier with a very sophisticated park design. In some of the literature described as a two-speed park. So there are certainly changes taking place in terms of the aesthetics of landscape design that in part reflect newly emerging cultures of nature, so that things that would previously have been cleared away or eradicated are seen as actually very interesting and maybe an addition to landscape design. And then a couple of other examples. Animal-aided design is quite a big topic in architecture, so that new buildings already have roosting spaces for bats, birds, and other organisms built into the idea from the start. And a lot of these recent discussions have been influenced by the French landscape designer, Gilles Clément, whose work I found very fascinating over a number of years. And one of the themes that Clément has reflected on is how to communicate to the public these ideas about more wild spaces of nature within cities. And one of the critical elements, perhaps, is an edge effect, as we see here, so that there are areas that are mowed more regularly, and then other areas that are mowed much more infrequently, and that to a public audience, at least, it seems that there's some kind of concept here. It's not that somebody simply forgot to do it, or they ran out of money. There is actually an idea here. So Clement, I think, is quite important. And we also, in relation to urban nature, one of the emerging strands is the idea of urban rewilding, which we come across more frequently now in the literature. And the Oostvaardersplassen project in the Netherlands, near Amsterdam, has been one of the axiomatic examples of a very ambitious urban rewilding project, which attempts to recreate some kind of Pleistocene landscape dominated by the grazing activities of large herbivores, in this case, wild horses. However, for those of you familiar with this project, things began to go wrong, and that many of the horses began to starve, and members of the public were insistent on trying to feed the horses through the fence to help them, which really annoyed the scientists who were determined to allow this site to go through a non-interventionist kind of progression of change. So we find in a way, a very kind of strange clash of different cultures of nature, in addition to which we might ask, what is the notional ecological baseline that would guide such a project, given that urban nature doesn't really have a clear reference point in relation to an ecological baseline? What is the wider rationale for what's being done here? So just a few quick remarks then, just to conclude. I mentioned at the start of the presentation that the literature on urban nature has grown hugely, and there are many journal articles, also a range of books as well. So it's a very vibrant field, and really part of what I've tried to do then in this presentation is to make sense of how this field is changing and evolving. And I think just to kind of leave you with one thought about this, quite a lot of the literature I've been discussing has been oriented towards both material and intellectual developments in Europe and North America. And I think that in order to build a richer sense of urban ecology and debates about urban nature, I think it's necessary to cast our lens wider. And part of my recent research has involved work on urban wetlands in Chennai in southern India. And this, for me, has really raised a whole set of interesting questions, perhaps occluded or not so present within some of the existing literature. So you have a situation where there's very rapid landscape change, that something like 90% of the urban wetlands from the Chennai metropolitan region have disappeared since the 1960s. However, it lies under one of the major global flyways for migratory birds. So the thing that I encountered here was thousands and thousands and thousands of birds crammed into a very small remaining set of these lakes with these industrial landscapes behind. So we have this sense of conflicting temporalities between these different ecological and landscape processes. So this was very interesting and important for me. And in addition, I went to a book fair where I was interested. It's a Tamil language book fair. It was interesting to me that there was a major range of environmental books, including a number of titles on the protection of birds, which is a major point of discussion within Chennai. And also there were translations of Rachel Carson and other environmental authors into Tamil. So a lot is going on here in terms of an emerging conceptual synthesis between different ideas and processes at a global scale, as well as at a local or regional scale. So I think that was my last slide. Yes, okay.
Thanks very much. We please, the whole audience, keep all your questions in mind, because we will now still quickly accompany the presentation from our side. from IOER side. And afterwards, we will still have, of course, lots of time for everyone to join our discussion. Just give me some few seconds. This is our tradition that we accompany the presentation of our main speakers also with some brief insights into our research that we conduct here at the IOER. Sorry, yeah. Here we go. And what we would like to feed in for the further discussion is that we created a biodiversity, urban biodiversity guidance for municipalities in Germany and even beyond to create so-called municipal biodiversity strategies. And that was really a hard and tough work to do, but we were successful in the end. Just let me start with the framing of our work, where we started. Of course, we have all these political targets now in the background, which are quite helpful for conducting this kind of urban municipal biodiversity guidance. So, of course, all started somehow with this taking up from the political side with the conventional biological diversity in 1992. But we even had further ongoing biodiversity strategies developed by the European Union. Here, for example, Biodiversity Strategy 2020, which entered the concept of green infrastructure, which is also a concept that is quite closely related to the urban situation. We even have the new EU Biodiversity Strategy 2030 now with a focal point on restoring ecosystems on the one side, but it's also addressing greening urban and peri-urban areas. Cities with at least 20,000 inhabitants should develop urban green plans. So there is really a political movement and a push to the officials within the municipalities to do more. And it's not just addressing the officials, but also all the actors in urban ecology. And coming from the, let's say, more international frame to the level of Germany here, we also have some really helpful framing political papers that help us to really conduct more and do more for urban ecology and urban biodiversity. For example, the Action Plan for Urban Nature that was launched in 2015, saying we need more space to experience of nature in the city and how to do this. That was part of this Naturschutzoffensive action plan. We have the Master Plan Urban Nature 2019 that really helps us to come up now with biodiversity strategies, and still quite new in December 2024, launched by the at that point of time still existing government on the federal level, the National Strategy for Biodiversity 2030, which addresses quite much also cities, urban landscapes, and settlements as hotspots for biodiversity. And all this in the background, now we try to motivate and convince the German municipalities to take up all these activities and create so-called biodiversity strategies on their municipal level, which is quite helpful, we feel. What are the advantages of doing so? And you can see already some examples here from Berlin, again, the strategy, but also from smallest towns like Blankenburg or Bamberg, which is in the south of Germany. And really, municipals start creating these kind of biodiversity strategies. What are the advantages? So it's informal, which is quite helpful. It's not legally binding, that strict, so it keeps the things and the action somehow kind of flexible and individual, which is really motivating the cities to take this up. It has a strategic approach with long-term perspective. So it's about setting overarching goals for each municipality on how to go and where to go with biodiversity in the future. It can create individual projects and bring individual and single projects, separated projects in a larger context, connect them all together with this strategical lens. pointing out synergies, taking inventory of previous activities. So having such a strategy is quite helpful for the cities to go ahead with doing more for urban ecology, like we have just heard from Matthew in a more global perspective. So now, quickly in the end, I will come to what we have done. We created and designed a guide for creating and designing these municipal biodiversity strategies. You can see lots of institutions, cities were involved in creating our so-called urban NBS, National Biodiversity Strategy for municipalities. It helps really to follow a structured way to set up these kind of biodiversity strategies. It was funded by the BMBF, so our educational ministry, our environmental ministry, and particularly by the Federal Nature Conservation Agency. And you can use this QR code to get open access to this English version that we have right now. So we started with creating a German version, of course, because it's addressing the German municipalities at a first glance. But then there was really the idea to make a translation and to conduct this and create this biodiversity strategy guideline also in an English version, which has now been launched quite some few months ago. And if you want to have open access, please use the QR code later on in our presentation. Just a few words in the end for the content. So it's about convincing the municipalities. So why should they create municipal biodiversity strategies? What are the motivations? What are arguments to go for such a strategy, which takes part of the first chapter here, but it's also elaborating on the steps in strategic development and implementation. So what do they have to think about? How should a starting phase for establishing such a strategy look like? What do you have to analyze? How can you come up with some measures, create design ideas, defining objectives? All that is elaborated in our biodiversity strategy guidance. And please don't hesitate. Please download it, use it for your own purpose in your home municipality. So some conclusions. It's of course quite important that you need a kind of binding city council resolution, something that really helps you from the political level to get the door open for creating such biodiversity strategy, get the backing from your politicians. This is really important. It should be found on a solid databasis. Do not start designing measures, ideas, objectives from scratch without having this, let's say, information in the background. So it's really important to start also gathering the data which is necessary on the habitats, plants, animals, and so on. And involve relevant stakeholders in the process, which is not just the formal municipal stakeholders working in the administration or local administration. Get the activists on board, get the NGOs on board, really formulate a bigger group of stakeholders that helps you to implement this strategy in the end, which means also involve citizens, quite important for the implementation phase. Secure funding, and in the end create monitoring and evaluation concept just to check whether this is really being implemented and it gets effective in practice. Yeah, some few accompanying words from the IOER. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks to the audience here. Thanks to the audience listening to us. Again, you can use the QR code, which we will also put onto our YouTube screen, video screen later on. And you can really get the free access to our guidance at this point. Thanks very much.